Hello there, and welcome. Today's video is going to be a real treat. Two horrifying true stories to keep you awake at night. I was 7 when I moved into that house at Ashbrook Lane. At least, that's what my parents tell me. My recollection of that time is vague. I have memories of the big green tree on our lawn, running around the garden with the boy next door, and I remember sitting on the living room floor playing with my He-Man figures. But my most vivid memories are the recurring nightmares. To the best of my knowledge, they happened every night I stayed in that house. The first time, I woke up during the early hours with a feeling that I was being watched. I lay there in the dark, listening intently, scared to move in case it drew the prowler's attention. I could hear or see nothing, but that feeling wouldn't go away. There was somebody or something in the room with me. I screwed up my eyes tightly, hoping it would just pass me by. I felt the bed shake and I stiffened up like a statue, afraid to even make the slightest movement. And then I heard the sound of raspy breathing from the foot of my bed. It moved round the side of me and then stopped. Moments passed silently. And then I felt the breath on my face. Instinctively, I opened my eyes. Saw a emaciated man in a lab coat looming over me. An expression of horror etched into his pale, gaunt face, veins bulging from his forehead. I tried to scream, but he grasped me around the throat with his skeleton-like fingers and dragged me out of bed. Jerking and contorting, I tried to grab onto something to stop him from taking me. He pulled me out of my room onto the landing where I gripped the stair rail. He pulled at my arms and then at my feet, and I kicked and screamed in a furious fight for my freedom. Next thing I knew, it was morning, and I was waking up in my parents' bed. They had found me sleepwalking across the landing in the middle of the night. I had a lot of nightmares as a kid, which was put down to my active imagination. But sleepwalking? That was a first. I saw him again the following night. He yanked me from my bed with no warning, and this time he managed to pull me down the stairs. Once again, I woke up in my parents' bed. My dad had woken up in the middle of the night and found me lying on the foot of the stairs. I worked myself into such a panic over these dreams that my parents allowed me to stay up late with them one night. We watched TV and I strained to stay awake. I don't remember going to bed that night. I just found myself sitting on the stairs observing the hallway, waiting for him to arrive. A grandfather clock stood in the hallway, taking away the minutes until part of the wall opened up to reveal a concealed doorway from which he emerged. He was wearing the same lab coat I'd seen him wear before, only this time it was smeared with blood. Whatever he'd been doing inside that room, I didn't want to find out. I watched with dread as he slowly and methodically slipped a pair of rubber surgical gloves onto his hands. He tented the fingers together and then turned and looked directly at me with his intense, deep-set eyes. Pained grimace stretched across his cocky face. I rushed upstairs, calling out for help as he crawled up behind me, swiping at my heels. I ran into my parents' bedroom. They were asleep and unaware of the commotion. Before I could reach their bed and shake them awake, my pursuer snatched me up in his bony arms and started pulling me away. I managed to grab onto the door frame, and despite his efforts, he could not pry me from it. He relented for a moment, his breath heavy and labored against my neck. Slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a scalpel before slicing deep into my hands. I released my grip on the door frame as blood dripped between my fingers. I shrieked out, but there was no sound. I could see Mom and Dad lying there, fast asleep, oblivious, as this withered specter hauled me out of their room and all the way down to the bottom of the stairs. I tried to crawl my way back up, leaving streaks of blood on the carpet and walls in my wake. He pressed his fingers against my throat. I whimpered and choked, and my limbs thrashed around in frenzy. That moment, the grandfather clock in the hallway let out a single chime, and he suddenly abandoned his fight. I looked up to see the emaciated figure creeping back through the door where he came from. The door sealed shut, disappearing into the wall as though it never existed. Point came where I started to confuse my dreams with reality. Couldn't tell if this was all in my mind or actually happening to me in the middle of the night. During the daylight hours, I examined the wall in the hallway, looking to see if there was some indication of a secret door. I told my parents and my nan about the dreams, and though I never doubted their concern, there was not a lot they could do except reassure me. I stayed with my parents, and when I got particularly distressed, either in their bed or we'd bring blankets and pillows downstairs and have a sleepover in the living room. Nothing helped. My tormentor found me night after night, waiting until Mom and Dad were asleep before hauling me away. I tried to call out, but my screams were always silent as he gripped his hand around my throat. He grew increasingly violent as he tried in vain to drag me into his secret room. Sometimes he would use his scalpel across my hands or under my fingernails. Other times he would inject me with a syringe, and it wasn't unusual for him to bite my fingers. As I prepared for the dreams, I rehearsed how I could try to fight him off, what I could grab onto as he dragged me downstairs. I knew if I could hold out until the clock chimed, then I would survive another night, because that's when his door sealed shut. What terrified me most was the realization that if he got me into a secret room before the chime of the clock, the door would seal behind us and nobody would ever see me or hear from me again. I don't remember much else about that house, but we didn't stay long. We moved in with my nan for a while, and even though there wasn't much room for all of us, at least the nightmares stopped, and so did the sleepwalking. Of course, I never forgot about those dreams. How could I? But I figured I was just a kid with an overactive imagination, and I never considered them particularly abnormal. That is, until my teens when I started to suspect something more sinister was at play. I was looking through old photo albums with my parents when we came across some from our old house at Ashbrook Lane. Something wasn't right about that house, I heard my mom say to my dad. This roused my curiosity. What do you mean, Mom? Well, I used to have bad feelings and nightmares when we were living there, she added. My dad tried to change the subject, but I persisted. What sort of nightmares? I inquired. I don't want to go into it, just violent and disturbing dreams. I had reoccurring nightmares in that house too, I said. You were too young to remember your dreams, my dad interrupted. You probably just picked up on something you heard us talking about. I felt insulted, like they were dismissing me. But you don't forget dreams like those. I tried pushing for more information. They weren't forthcoming. It wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that we were able to talk about it again. I was in the living room with my parents and my dad was reading the paper. Casually told my mom, Our old house on Lashbrook Lane is up for sale again. Nobody stays there long, she replied. Makes you wonder. My dad nodded in agreement. So what exactly happened at that house? I interjected. Maybe it was because so much time had passed, or perhaps it was because I was older. But they were more open with me this time. My mom explained how she had visions of a violent murderer, dead bodies laying on the floor, blood all over the wall. She claimed she had felt a presence when she was alone. She would often hear crying, and it sounded like it was coming from inside the house. She also revealed that my aunt and uncle had come down from Manchester to stay one weekend, and woke up in the middle of the night to see a figure of a tall man standing at the bottom of the bed. My aunt and uncle had passed away by this point, so I was unable to ask them about their experiences. But my mom explained that they were so distressed by the incident, they returned home the next day. I asked my dad, "Did you have anything weird happen?" My dad has always been a very grounded skeptic, but I knew something had affected him too, though he wouldn't admit it. "There was an uncomfortable feeling," he said, and volunteered nothing more. Ever since learning of my mom, aunt, and uncle's experiences in that house, I've been overwhelmed with curiosity. Like my dad, I'm quite the skeptic, and I was convinced there's a rational explanation for all of this. Even so, I wanted to know more about that house. From time to time, I would check the newspaper, and just as my parents had said, the house was rarely occupied for more than 6 months before going for sale. There wasn't much more I could find out at this time. I'm sure the information and history is available in some archive somewhere, but I wouldn't know where to start. However, I was passing by that area one day, got the idea to drive by the house. It was unoccupied, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary and felt no chills or foreboding. It was just an old house. But still, I wanted to know more. I noted down the phone number on the for sale sign, and later that day I called the estate agents and requested a viewing. The lady who met me for the viewing introduced herself as Andrea. We went inside and immediately I felt a shiver run down my body. It was probably my mind running away with me, but I got this eerie feeling. I can only describe it as being like the tension that lingers in the air after a big argument. If I'm honest, I barely recognized the interior of the house. My memory was vague, but there was one area that brought to mind those reoccurring nightmares I had as a child. That was a hallway. I tried not to draw attention to myself and continued the tour as Andrea gave me her sales pitch. As we walked around, I was convinced that the wall in the hallway was hiding something. "What's behind this wall?" I asked. The look on her face at that moment could disguise none of the lies she proceeded to tell me. First, she told me there was nothing there. It wasn't my intention to make her uncomfortable, but I had come this far, and I wanted answers. "There's at least 15 feet between here and the external wall," I pointed out. I heard her mumbling on about some old boiler room that they had bricked over. She stopped mid-sentence when I started knocking against the wall. This was not my usual kind of behavior. It was as though I'd been consumed by an obsession. "You know something, don't you?" Andrea asked me, a tone of surrender in her voice. "I used to live here as a kid. Something isn't right about this house, is it?" Although still apprehensive, it was as if I'd freed her from an eternal silence. "It could cost me my job if I told you." "It can't be much worse than I already suspect," I said. "Was somebody murdered here?" She hesitated and took a cautious glance over her shoulder. "Do you mind if we talk about this somewhere else? I'm not really comfortable talking about it here." We decided to go for a coffee, and this is what I learned. In 1955, Dr. Henry Fenton moved into Ashbrook Lane with his family, Mary and their teenage son, Raymond. The upper floor would serve as their living quarters, and he had the lower part of the house converted into a doctor's practice. His office was set just off the hallway opposite his prized grandfather clock. Things were going well for the Fentons and the business was thriving. And then, one day, Mary fell down the stairs in their home and broke her neck. She died instantly. Henry reacted to the tragedy by immersing himself in his work, using the practice as a distraction from his heartache. Raymond, on the other hand, was struggling to come to terms with his mother's death. With his father too busy to offer emotional support he needed, he started to drift. He fell in with a bad crowd, started skipping school, and there were a couple of times he had been caught drinking or brawling and was escorted home by the police. Henry barely noticed nor cared during this time. Once he closed his practice for the day, he would collapse into his armchair and attempt to repress his grief with liquor. Some nights he'd drink himself into a coma. Other nights he would fly into a rage, smashing furniture and throwing things around the room. And sometimes it was his son who bore the brunt of his temper. Raymond was taken in by his grandparents soon after, leaving Henry Fenton all alone in that house on Ashbrook Lane. Later that year, on a cold autumn night, Henry was awoken by a disturbance from downstairs. Emboldened by the liquor, he decided to go and confront his intruder. His practice was the only thing he had going for him, and he refused to let some thug take that away. Henry tiptoed downstairs in the darkness. He saw the light of a torch in the far room and heard the intruder rummaging through cupboards and shelves. Probably some junkie after the drugs and syringes he kept in the premises. Henry snuck into his office, withdrew a scalpel from the drawer and tucked into a corner and waited. The intruder entered the room, a rucksack over his shoulder and his face covered by a black mask. Henry sprung out of the darkness, brandishing the scalpel, and ordered him to drop the bag. The masked man panicked and lunged towards him, attempting to push past and make his escape. Henry swiped out blindly, and as he fell backwards against the wall, the intruder staggered along the hallway and opened the front door before collapsing on the doorstep. Henry got to his feet and approached the fallen man. Blood gushed from the deep incision across his throat from where the scalpel had made contact. Henry pulled the mask from the man's head to clear his airways. Staring back at him in the moonlight, eyes wide with terror, Henry saw the face of his son, Raymond. His heart wrenched at the sight before him. What had he done? How could he have known? His professional instincts kicked in and he sprung to action. Raymond thrashed about, choking and gurgling on his own blood as his father gripped his throat, pressing his bony fingers firmly against the wound in an attempt to contain the bleeding. He proceeded to drag him towards the office where he could clamp and stitch the laceration. By the time he got him there, however, it was too late. At that moment, his grandfather clock in the hallway let out a single chime. Patients turned up to the practice the following day to find Raymond cradled in Dr. Fenton's arms. Unable to come to terms with killing his own son, Henry had turned the scalpel upon himself, slashing his own wrist before bleeding to death on the floor of his office. I consider myself a sensible person. I scoff at ghost stories and roll my eyes at the thought of a fourth kind. As an adult, I can easily disregard the notion that there is a supernatural realm that could affect me. But there is one problem with my current ability to ignore all things mysterious. A series of events that contradicts my disbelief. As a child, I heard things, however, I should be more specific, as I do not mean music or laughter or the innocuous, normal sounds belonging to our everyday surroundings. The things I heard were spoken by 3 distinct voices, and they all had ill intentions for me. You may be thinking, oh, these voices could have been talking about anyone, but they called me by my name. You may also be thinking, children have nightmares, and I cannot force you to believe what I have experienced is real. All I can do is share with you in hopes that telling the story will provide me with some relief. The most vivid recollection I have of the voices is actually the first time I heard them. At least, I think it was the first time. I can now point to this event as the beginning of it all. But I know how easily my other childhood memories could have blurred together and altered unintentionally in the years since growing up. In the interest of retelling, however, I can say with relative confidence that the first night I heard the voices, I was 7 years old. I was in an awkward phase. Though, in the interest of full disclosure, my life has been a 24-year-long awkward phase, and was still struggling with Not only a severe lisp, but a stutter as well. My hair was cut in a blunt, harsh bob style at that age, adding to my peculiar look, as I was not only short but also scrawny in the limbs with a pudgy stomach. Cute, right? All awkwardness aside, I was a fairly happy child, despite a somewhat traumatizing home life that can be boiled down to Daddy has a terrible drinking problem, but we pretend it doesn't exist and attend church like a good family should. The fact that I was raised in a church makes this story even more disturbing to me in retrospect, though in my mature mind at this time, I've never made a connection between my religious upbringing and the demonic presence in my home. So this vivid recollection, one seemingly average night as a 7-year-old, I lay safely in my race car bed. Being a tomboy had some advantages. My routine at that age included listening to religious-themed audiobook stories, which I found soothing for whatever reason. The cassette rolled as usual, and I began to drift off to sleep as usual. But that night, I was awoken by the voices from beneath my room. Let me clarify something. My bed was positioned next to an archaic air vent, under which was the first floor of the house. More specifically, my room was above the first floor bathroom, and the style of the vent in my floor made it possible to see and hear what was happening in the room below. The novelty of this view had grown old, and I no longer spied down to the sink, the only part of the bathroom I could see clearly, on a daily basis. So when I heard soft murmuring underneath my room, I at first subconsciously processed the voices as my parents, having a quiet discussion in the bathroom. I continued to drift. I remember that I suddenly realized there were more than 2 voices. Though my brother and sister were born by that time, neither was old enough to speak in a clearly distinguishable voice. The drifting stopped. I sat up in confusion. I would like to tell you that I panicked immediately and because alarmed, but that just isn't how it happened. I was only perplexed, as I knew there were only 2 adults in my home, and there were 3 adult-toned voices conversing beneath me. From my position on the bed, I could not hear clearly what was being said, and as I was not entirely concerned at that point, I inched off my mattress slightly closer to the vent. I could not see down through the metal slats as the light in my room and the light in the bathroom were off, but I could certainly hear more clearly. Following is my best possible recollection of what was said. I did not claim to remember word for word, and the phrases were spoken softly, so I had trouble understanding exactly what was being said. But this narrative should give a general idea of the voices said to me. She's asleep. We knew she'd be asleep. She's a child. It is night. But there's no reason to waste time. She will wake up. This is kinder for her. There is no kindness. These voices, obviously discussing me, belong to 2 males and 1 female. Though her tone was raspy and deep for a girl, I remember thinking, after the first male voice had spoken the last sentence, there was silence. I shook my head and told myself I was hearing things, or maybe I was still asleep. I pinched a bit of my arm flesh between my fingers to wake myself up, to no avail. You may be wondering if I ran into the room of my parents for help or to alert them of what I had heard, but I did not. I had learned never to disturb them in the night, and so I tried to talk myself into a calm state of mind despite my rapid heart rate and sinking stomach. I eventually found peaceful rest, and did not give a second thought to my nighttime terror as the next day dawned and passed without incident. That night, and many nights after, were free from the voices. I eventually dismissed the notion that anything could have even happened, convincing myself it had just been a nightmare, a bad dream. Several weeks later, I believe, it happened again. Same setup, so I won't walk you through all of the mundane details. This time the voices were making plans. You may question how I remember this, and although I will admit I don't remember the exact specifics, I knew the plans were being made to harm me. After this second occurrence of hearing the voices, they came more often, having started to formulate their plans more concretely at this point. The plans seemed to change in nature. I heard things ranging from burning me repeatedly to kidnapping to torturing me for information about some unknown secret. It seemed to me that they did not care what the plan was, only that I was harmed. At this point, it seems logical to you as readers that I should have disclosed my nighttime experiences to my parents, but I think I was still trying to convince myself that I was in the wrong. I was imagining these voices, and no one would believe me if I did not even believe myself. So I kept quiet and continued to listen to them. I got to know them, almost as if they were friends. Thinking back, I realized that I was a lonely child with few friends and a lack of love or nurturing in my home. I felt somewhat comforted by their presence after a while. The terror turned to familiarities. Sure, these voices had bad ideas about me and wanted to inflict pain on me, but they used my name. They knew where I was. They kept coming back. One male voice, first I had heard, was cold, decisive. He knew what needed to be done, though the plan kept changing. He always had new and more extreme ideas. He never used my name. Second male voice seemed to have mercy. He'd always mentioned that I needed to be asleep before they could do anything in order to make sure it was as painless as possible. He used my name regularly. She was malicious, graphic, and brutal. She wanted to harm me the most. She used my name occasionally, but with an edge in her voice that made it feel like my name was a dirty word. After a while, I wish I could tell you how long, but my memories of that time are vague and inaccurate, I started to try and stay awake for as long as I could in order to catch more of their conversations. They would repeat the plans, uttering the same phrases multiple times, almost as if they were trying to bore me into sleep. But I also somehow knew that they didn't know I was awake. I began to think that staying awake was the only way I could prevent terrible things from happening to me. I would sit up in bed on the edge of my mattress, legs dangling over the side, and listen to stories to keep myself awake. I would occasionally drift off to the sound of their voices, which had become almost as soothing as they were terrifying. But on nights when I could manage to stay awake until dawn, I would trudge through my day following the night of vigilant sleeplessness, proud of my ability to beat the voices. Even though nothing happened to me when I did fall asleep for any length of time, part of my brain told me that awake equated to safety and sleep to death. Nights without sleep passed. The voices changed their plans. I struggled to stay awake in school. It became a routine as listening to my audiobooks on cassette. Maybe wondering another thing. You may be very curious readers. Why didn't I turn on the lights in the bedroom before bed so I could look down into the room and see whose voices belonged to? I tried that. I would turn on the lights, and one of my parents would flick it off before bedtime. I also tried sneaking downstairs and turning it on after they'd gone to bed. By the time I would reach my room and try to peer through the rusting slats of the air vent, the light would be off again, making me wonder if I had turned it off at all. I began to feel like I was part of a twisted game that forced me to ask myself questions. Would I fall asleep? Why can't I get the lights to stay on? Was I really hearing anything? As I quizzed myself each night, laying in bed tormented by the trio of voices, the terror grew. Not because the threat to my safety increased or frightened me more. I began to question my sanity. As a young child, to become so unhinged I now realize was normal, based on my belief that 3 people were underneath my room discussing plans to torture me. But at the time, I was determined to find my own fault in it. If only I could stay awake all night. If only I could see who it was. If only I wasn't a bad girl who deserved to have these things happen to her. They seemed so sure that I needed to be hurt. I started to believe it. I decided to sleep through the night and let them carry out their plans. I was tired. I was guilty. I just wanted the confusion to stop. I slept all night, and all the next day, and that night as well. I slept for 36 hours. I remember my mom coming in and out of the room, tenderly pressing her hand to my forehead, presuming to check for a fever. Little did she know that I was the healthiest I'd been in a long time. Nothing happened. No plans were carried out. I rested my mind and my body. I awoke eventually and went to school. My mother asked if I felt ill. I didn't, and told her so. Voices did not return that night, or the next night. They did not return to my childhood. When I look back on that period of my life, it is easy to chalk up my experiences with the voices as normal childhood fear of monsters. I wish I could. I am so solidly a disbeliever in anything paranormal that it makes no sense to me that anything in the realm could have occurred. Did any of this happen? I have given you my most honest recollections. I leave it up to you to decide. Thank you for letting me release my inner demons. I consider myself a sensible person. I hope I can stay awake tonight. I need to stay awake. So that's the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. I definitely enjoyed making it. I think I may actually start doing videos like this more often. I kind of like doing themed videos with multiple stories within them. Kind of makes it more interesting. Oh, and one more thing before I go. Always remember,
what you can't see can still haunt you.